And as Val said, I'll be talking about the early history of the pioneer cemeteries. The very first one started in 1871 at the original Phoenix town site, and that was used until 1884 when the cemeteries were moved to about a half a mile west of town, and a group of cemeteries were built there. And that's the current Pioneer and Military Memorial Park that is owned by the city as the city park and run by the PCA, the Pioneer Cemetery Association, as Val said. And they've done a lot of things over the past 40 years in charge of different cemeteries and so on. But one of the main things they've done, we're all proud of, is the amount of research that has gone into learning about the cemetery. And in the second half of the talk, the first half will be just about how the cemeteries were set up. The second half will be just a brief review of two of the research projects that we are currently doing at Pioneer Cemetery. So let's begin with the original Phoenix town site. And the original Phoenix town site was not too big. It was just a mile east and west from 7th Avenue to 7th Street and a half a mile north to south, Van Buren to Harrison. And the first lots were put on sale at the town site in December of 1870. The way that the site was laid out, there were 98 town blocks, and two of them were designated for public use. There was one for a courthouse square, as you see in the center, and the other one for a plaza. But there was no designation for anywhere that could be used as a graveyard or as a cemetery. And given the time period, a new town in the American West in the 1870s, that was really not too unusual of a thing to not have a plan for when the town first started. Of course, they were much more concerned with getting the town going to make sure that the town survived, rather than where they would put anyone who passed away during that initial period. So the preferred method in most places in the West was to put the cemetery far enough outside of town that you didn't have to see it every day. You'd have to walk by it every day, but near enough so that when you did need to use it, it wasn't too much of a hassle. It wasn't too hard to get to. Unfortunately, there wasn't any place directly right outside the town site to put a cemetery in Phoenix at this time. All around, all the edges of the town site were already homesteaded and private land. So they did the next best thing, and that when it was time to begin burials, they started using the southwest corner of the original town site. And I say that's the next best thing because when Phoenix first started, it was up in the northeast quarter or the northeast corner where most of the action was. That's where the earliest businesses were and the residences. So the furthest southwest corner would have been the farthest distance that they could put between the day-to-day action and the cemetery. Anyhow, over the next decade through the 1870s, it actually grew to cover four different town blocks, or at least four different town blocks were involved in the graveyard. And the thing about the graveyard, it was never officially designated as a cemetery. No one ever purchased the land. There were no rules or regulations. In other words, there was no one actually in charge of the cemetery. So as time went on, it wasn't very organized. I mean, the graves were not laid out in nice, even rows, and there weren't people there that would go by weekly and pick up the trash and so on. So it came to be kind of an eyesore, and meaning that there was trash around and it needed to be picked up. And by the end of the 1870s, that became an issue for the town fathers, because in 1879 was when the Southern Pacific Railroad made it as far east as the town of Maricopa, which is about 35 miles or so south of Phoenix. And goods headed for Phoenix were unloaded at Maricopa onto wagons, horse-drawn wagons, and drawn and taken up to Phoenix. And as they entered the town, the main road between Maricopa and Phoenix was right along here, 7th Avenue. That meant that all the freight had to go past this not so good-looking cemetery, and more importantly, that's where the stagecoaches went also. So people who were potentially looking at Phoenix as a place to live or just wanted to visit, they really didn't want their first impression to be a first look at this place. So that, in addition to other issues the town was having by the late 1870s, including problems with their irrigation, water distribution, and problems keeping the roads going and sidewalks, they the town of Phoenix incorporated into a city in 1881, which would give them the ability to levy some taxes and get some money together and take care of some of the city services. But they knew that they had a cemetery problem by 1879. Although they didn't really do anything about it, the first thing that happened didn't occur until 1884. Well, this guy over here on the right became a mayor, a man named DeForest Porter, and he was mayor on two occasions in Phoenix. In those days, the mayoral terms were 1 year long, and they went from about May of 1 year to April of the next. So he was mayor from 1884, 1885, and then again from 1887 to 1888. And it was under his watch that most of the action that was taken to develop new cemeteries and make use of the old were taken. Anyhow, at his inaugural address in 1884, he stated that he had a solution for the cemetery problem that we were having. He said there were three fraternal organizations who were building a cemetery just a half a mile away over in the addition to town known as Nearest Addition, and that they bought a big plot of land, they bought a big lot, and they were only going to use half of it. So maybe somebody would want to propose a plan uh, to the city to see if they would want to purchase that extra area for the city cemetery, which Porter thought was a good idea. So what he was talking about, oh, just over to the west, here we're at 7th Avenue, the original cemetery. A half mile to the west is 15th Avenue. And you see this large blank space that's Block 52 that the fraternal organizations bought. And Porter would know exactly what was going on in Near's Addition because he was a good friend of David Near, who owned this piece of land. And he was actually the real estate agent. In addition to being mayor, he was the real estate agent for that for the addition. So he was the one who sold the land to the fraternal organizations in the first place. And here's what they did with them. There were three organizations: Freemasons, otherwise known as Masons; IOOF, which is the International Order of the Odd Fellows; and the Knights of Pythias. Those were the first three fraternal organizations that, in early summer of 1884, set up a cemetery on the east half of this Block 32 at 15th Avenue and Harrison. The Knights of Pythias, just a few months later, at the beginning of 1885, sold their lower grave blocks to another fraternal organization known as the Ancient Order of United Workmen. So they wound up having, within a few months, having four different cemeteries there. Anyhow, the gentleman who decided to take up the gauntlet and prepare the west half of the block and try to sell it to the city was a guy named Jerry Millay, who once again, Phoenix was a small town, and Jerry Millay and DeForest Porter were good friends. They were actually law partners until a month before this. But anyhow, he went to the city and asked if they would be interested, and they said, yes, go ahead and lay it out like a cemetery, and we'll see how much we want. And he did that, and that was finished by the late summer of 1884. And he brought the city to take a look at it, and they say, well, that looks good, but we really don't need all 4 acres there in that west half. We only need about 1 acre, maybe one and a quarter. So on that day in late summer, he sold this bottom 25% of that side of the block to the city. And on the same day, you probably knew this in advance, but the one of the city councilmen was there, a man named John Loosely. And John Loosely owned a saloon in downtown Phoenix known as the Capitol Saloon. And he decided to go into the cemetery business. So Millay sold the other 3/4 of the lot to John Loosely. And Loosely, you see the city in pink, you see a little blue blocks there. Loosely sold those to the county of Maricopa, who a month or two later wanted their own cemeteries. So what we have at the very beginning of 1875 are 7 brand new cemeteries, and we have the right half, which is four cemeteries owned by fraternals, and you would have had to have been a member of their organization in order to be buried there. You have the top two-thirds of loosely cemetery, it's called, and that's for private citizens. If you had the money to buy a grave, then you could buy a place there and be buried. And then the bottom quarter had the county and city cemeteries. And those were used for indigents. Those were used for people that who either didn't have any money to be buried, or family didn't have any money, or in some cases they didn't know who the person was, but they knew that they passed away within the city limits, so they had to be buried there somehow. So the term for that, of course, are potter's fields. So you have a couple potter's fields there. So now that that's all set, and now they have a new place to put people. Now it's time to address what to do with the old cemetery. And right off the bat, loosely, he advertised his new cemetery as a wonderful, beautiful place. And if you want to move your family over to the new cemetery, buy plots here. I will help you move, and we'll give you the best locations in the new cemetery. So that helped to move some of the people out of the old cemetery, but that really wasn't enough. It wasn't until 1888 or late 1887 when DeForest Porter came back as mayor again that he decided to use city employees to clear out the old cemetery. And he did that, and by the spring of 1888, he declared these four blocks. This is the old cemetery in the original uh, Phoenix Township. He declared these four blocks to be free of any burials, to be free of graves. And that meant because his land had never been purchased by any individuals, nobody wanted to buy a city block right next to the cemetery. And now that it was no longer a town, but a city, that the land became part of the city of Phoenix. So it was up to DeForest Porter to decide what to do with these four blocks. And what he did, the very first one, because in the interim, over this amount of time, 15 years, now the whole town site was occupied with people, and the west side was growing and needed some services. So that's where they built a school called the West End School. They felt it was time to put a grammar school there, grammar and high school there. And this was comparable to the East End School they had at the other end of the town site, and they even used the same blueprints to put this one here at the west side and called it the West End School. The other three lots, Porter decided that he would benefit the whole city of Phoenix and somehow get a railroad in here that came from the north, came from the Prescott area. So he made an offer. He said that any railroad company that promises to come into this area and begin to lay down tracks on this plot of land, we will give them these three different city blocks if you lay the tracks and you build a depot. And that was a fair amount of money in those days. Each one of these were worth several $1,000s each. So it was a good offer, but it took until 1893 until the Santa Fe Railroad came in and said, "Well, we'll do it." And they began to build their tracks in the early 1890s. And they used pretty much the entire south half of the old cemetery, that portion south of Jackson Street, as railroad tracks. And as you can see, they put a freight depot right on the corner of Fifth Avenue in Jackson, which at the time was a wooden structure that they built right there. And Santa Fe was given Lot 58 there, the north half, but they only used the southern half for warehouses along the tracks. And the northern half they sold out to other people, to private individuals, because they did not have a need for it. So that's how the first city cemetery went. That's what it looked like by the 1890s. And if we fast forward a little bit over a century to about 2010, by this point, the north half of the cemetery was designated to become the site of the new Maricopa County Sheriff's Office complex, which included the office and the jail. So as we do in a city, there has to be cultural resource investigation of the prehistoric cultural resources. So the archaeologists went out and they found plenty of prehistoric remains from the prehistoric civilization for the Hohokam. And they tested them and analyzed them and decided, well, we've got that figured out. So it's all clear. You can go ahead and build your complex. So they got started, and one of the things they did was to dig deeper than apparently the archaeologists expected to build their parking garage. And on the way down to build the parking garage, they began to see bones and pieces of wood that were parts of coffins. So the excavators stopped and they brought the archaeologists back in and they saved him this pedestal of dirt right here. That's what was saved by the time they called in and said, maybe we should stop tearing this place up. The archaeologists came back in, they did excavations, and they wound up finding what they believed to be the bones of 14 different in individuals. So they did their analysis, they repackaged the bones that they collected and reburied them in 2013 at Pioneer Cemetery there on Jefferson. And then the place where they put them was in an old family plot that had been abandoned at one time at the cemetery. So buried in 2013 and dedicated in 2014. If for some reason you decided to take a little day trip and go down to 7th Avenue in Jackson and see the site of the original cemetery in Phoenix, which could be an exciting day trip for some, this is what you'd see. You'd see on the whole north half of the building. In Jackson, you'd see just the huge complex. It's a very large building. And that takes up the entire 2 blocks that are north of Jackson between 7th Avenue and 5th. And on the bottom half is also a very large parking garage, and that called the Jackson Street Parking Garage or the Jackson Street Garage. And that's been there quite a while. You'll also see a second little building, and that's a later version of the original wood Santa Fe Railroad that was first put in 1893. So that's what you see if you went to the first cemetery in Phoenix. So after 1890, 2 additional cemeteries were put into place right across the street, just to the north from the first 7 that were made in 1884. The first of those is a cemetery called Porter, right there in the pink on Madison. And that piece of land that was owned by Lulu Porter that she had been using since the late 1880s as a family cemetery. Her husband was DeForest Porter, the mayor that we've been talking about, and he passed away in about 1888. And she buried him on that land, in addition to her father, a man named Joseph Cotton, who was an early pioneer in downtown Phoenix. So she had a private cemetery by the late 1880s and decided to go public with it in 1891. And on the plat maps, on the ownership maps at that time, the cemetery is listed here as a Mrs. Porter Cemetery, which I think is a pretty nice name for a cemetery, actually. But anyhow, right after they opened, the Grand Army of the Republic, which was the Union veteran organization in Phoenix, just bought a whole bunch of lots from Porter, so that their veterans who had moved to Phoenix and had passed away in Phoenix would have a place to be buried. And that's these grave blocks that are marked in blue. A year or two later, the Confederate organization that was comparable to the GAR, but for the Confederate soldiers, they thought that was a good idea, and they bought a few blocks for their veterans too. And since that time, Porter has been known as the area of the cemetery that has a lot of military veterans buried there. It doesn't, there are veterans buried all throughout the cemeteries, but there's a higher percentage of the graves in Porter are veterans than in other cemeteries. And they're from 5 different wars, as you see here on the monument that's in the cemetery: the Mexican War, the Civil War, Indian Campaign, Spanish American, and Philippine insurrection. The final cemetery in this group of cemeteries is Rosedale. And the Rosedale story is pretty similar to the Porter story. This was a piece of private land owned by a guy named George Loring, who was an early pioneer in Phoenix. He came here in the 1870s. He owned this land and he was using it as a private cemetery for his family by the late 1880s. And he actually built a vault, a cement vault. And inside that, by the 1888 or so, would have been his father, his first wife, and a couple of his children. By the late 1890s, he was kind of short on money, so he decided to get together some cash, and he teamed up with a real estate person in town by the name of Walker. And Walker decided the thing to want to do was to develop it as a cemetery and then sell it off so that Loring could get some money out of it. And Walker, he wound up selling it to his cousin, who was an 18-year-old woman by the name of Hortensia Perry, who lived in San Diego. And so I guess they were close. I don't know for sure, but the Perry's family apparently had quite a bit of money, and this was like one of this young lady's maybe first investments in land acquisition. But anyhow, Walker, knowing that she was living in San Diego, knowing that she could not take care of it that well, he offered that he and a friend would be the people who would sell the grave lots and make sure that people were buried in the right places and do some maintenance and and so on. So that's the final cemetery at what is now Pioneer and Military Memorial Park. So it consists of 9 different cemeteries. 3 of them are privately owned and for the general public, Rosedale, Porter, and Loosley. 2 of them are Potter's Fields owned by governments, the county and the city. And 4 of them were owned by fraternal organizations, which have been private cemeteries just for members of that or organization. Even before Rosedale was laid out, there were some rumblings about how well the cemetery was being taken care of. In particular, the Masons, I didn't think it was the west half of the cemetery looked as good as the east half. Turns out the Masons, the Oddfellows, and the Knights of Pythias, and the United Workers, and apparently Porter, went together and hired someone to do the groundskeeping so they could keep the grass green and keep it tidied up and so on. On the west half, however, that didn't happen. We wound up having 2 absentee landlords. Well, I told you about Hortensia Perry, who lived in San Diego, and apparently her cousin Walker didn't quite keep up to his end of the bargain. And loosely, although he lived here when he purchased the cemetery in 1884, by 1891 he had moved to San Francisco, and he was only here once or twice a year. So they weren't paying too much attention to it. And then, of course, the county and city lots were, they were of necessity. They really weren't something that the city put a lot of time and effort into beautifying. So anyhow, so that cemetery not looking quite as good as they wanted it to look. And the Masons, they have quite a few people, and so maybe they were running out of room too. That's a possibility. The Masons decided to start a new cemetery in town. So they bought a 40-acre plot and they opened a new cemetery at 23rd Avenue in Van Buren. They were joined a year or two later by the Knights of Pythias, who also bought a plot of land next to where the Masons were. And they joined together. And this is a cemetery that was known for many, many years as Greenwood Cemetery. It's still currently active, and it's now known as the Greenwood Memory Lawn and Mortuary, and it's now 192 acres. So it's a pretty sizable cemetery, and currently in use. The Masons did a couple things differently than what had been done at Pioneer. First of all, they made it a perpetual care cemetery, meaning that you paid a little extra, but there was a guarantee that the lawns would be kept up for a long period of time, even possibly after your family passed away and so on. And they made it so that you did not have to be a member of the Masons or any other group in order to be buried here. So it turned out to be a lot more successful. It's been around now for 120 years. Anyhow, once the Masons moved out, that really didn't help the looks of the cemetery. Now you have, we believe there was as many as 200 people were moved out of the cemeteries on Jefferson over to Greenwood Cemetery. And that, of course, made the place look even worse. The piles of dirt from the graves or sunken graves and trash around and so on. That started kind of a civic movement against the cemetery that peaked at this newspaper article that came out in 1914, and it just goes over how trash the cemetery looked like and smelly and dirty. Pretty much the exact same complaints that had been made in 1879 against the original cemetery in the town site. So anyhow, this fellow really advocated for closing the cemetery and hopefully moving everybody out and turning it into a subdivision where the land could become profitable and useful to the city of Phoenix. Or if that failed, at least you could cover it over and make it a nice green park or something. Anyhow, the city of Phoenix was apparently convinced. And in 1914, they passed an ordinance saying that it would be illegal to bury any human beings within the city limits of Phoenix. Now, since this was the only city cemetery within the city limits of Phoenix, we could see that it was pretty well directed to shutting down these cemeteries. So that's what happened in 1914. That was the end of the nine cemeteries' useful functioning. Um, and over the next 25 years, there were several plans that were proposed to, again, either make it a park or move people out. But nobody really pulled the trigger on it because it was such a large investment to clear up the place, and without a guarantee of getting the money back or turning a profit, that nobody wanted to really do it. So no one ever did. And by the late 1930s, the place was a mess again. Vandals had lived there, and the monuments were broken, and so on. And the Arizona Pioneer Association said, this is really shameful. These are the people here that these are the original pioneers who started our city. We should show them some respect. And they're dead, but we should have a nice place for them at least. And the Arizona Pioneer Association started the Pioneer Cemetery Association, which was a group that came in and really did a lot of work around the cemetery. They cleared out a lot of the vegetation, picked up the garbage, built a new fence around it, but a metal fence around it, repaired a lot of the monuments, as you see right here, and made a map of the cemetery. And they were going very well. They had very active in doing things until one of the two principal people who were really behind it pushing this died suddenly at the end of 1940, a man named Thomas Hayden. And no one really took it up after him. That kind of things kind of fizzled out. And then, of course, a year later, we were into World War II. So once again, the cemetery area went into a period of neglect. And this particular period lasted over 40 years. And it wasn't until the mid 1980s when, again, people came by and said, this should be a nicer place. People should show some respect to the pioneers. And that's when the second incarnation of the Pioneer Cemetery Association took place. And we're the same group that are still there over 40 years later. And initially, a huge amount of work was done by the PCA. Again, with the cleanup, they put in a new fence and fixed a lot of the monuments. Began to do a lot of research for people that are buried there because these nine cemeteries didn't have a lot of cooperation, so there was no master list of who is actually there. And also importantly, they brought in a large house, an old Victorian home, and put it on the cemetery grounds, which now serves as a visitor center and research center, as it's known as the Smurthwaite House. And the PCA continues to do a lot of, in addition to tours and maintaining the place on a day-to-day basis and stuff, also still doing a lot of research and conservation. We just completed 6 years of conservation of all the stone monuments there. The ones that were fixed in the 40s were refixed, and a lot of them had been broken again anyways. So a whole 6 year program, and it looks really good. There's been several publications on the cemetery done by researchers. There's been a couple of hundred of biographies of the people who are buried here done within just the past 2 years. And they completed a book of detailing everybody that we know of who was buried here at one time. And it's a couple of years old now, but it was over 3,800 graves we believe were here, and it's probably more than that. And every year we do add just a few more. So anyhow, so we are still involved in research and historical research of the cemetery, and that's why I wanted to go over two research projects that we're currently involved in that I think are kind of interesting. And the first of these is deals with who made these monuments, or at least get us some of the people who made these monuments. There are over 600 and something monuments in the cemeteries, but I'd say maybe six, maybe eight of them have any kind of a mark on them that indicates who made the monuments. Most of them seem to be places in California. There's one or two from someone down in Tucson, but for the most part, the other 600 plus, we really don't know where they came from. Though we probably believe, well, around 1900, Sears and Roebuck began to sell their gravestones by mail order, and Montgomery Ward followed a couple of years later. So we know some of them are from that, but the bulk we really don't know. And it wasn't until pretty recently that we found out there was a monument maker here, a stonemason who made memorial monuments, in addition to owning a quarry of granite, a granite quarry here locally right at South Mountain. And that guy's name is Leon Legier. As you see here in the picture, that's a picture of his monument yard right down the street from the cemetery at 3rd Avenue and Jefferson. Second picture showing the front where the little fence. But he was born in Ohio and he came out here to Phoenix in the 1890s, moved to Mesa first, did work for a monument maker there. He worked on a couple of the buildings here in town as a mason, the most famous being the Adams Hotel, was a big building. He also worked on what's known as Old Main, which is the oldest building on the ASU campus that was also done in the 1890s. So let's see here. We do have three examples of his work. We know this from the newspaper reports. On the left-hand side is a large granite monument that with a big acorn on top, obviously. But this is a big monument, and this originally was placed for Thomas Elvey in Porter Cemetery in Pioneer Cemeteries. A couple of years later, when the cemeteries were going downhill and closing, the family moved it over to Greenwood Cemetery, which is where it now sits. Over on the far right, over here, is a marble monument for W.G. Davis, and this is located in the city cemetery in Mesa. And Davis passed away in 1901, and this may have been when Legier was working for the Mason for the monument place over in Mesa. In the center is kind of a natural boulder of granite. But if you look closely at it, you'll see there's some carvings in here, and that's a name. And that name is Clarence H. Shaw. And Clarence H. Shaw was a young fellow who came from Chicago out here because he had tuberculosis, came here for the cure, lived here about 6 years before he passed away. He was a photographer and an Indian trader and a good friend of Charlotte Hall, who was an Arizona Territory historian and so on. Clarence Shaw is also the namesake of Shaw Butte, which is one of the formations in the North Mountains in Phoenix. Anyhow, he told his friend that he did not want to be buried in a cemetery. And his friend was a man by the name of Mr. Holly, who happened to be an undertaker. He was part of the firm Merriman and Holly. And either Holly asked Leger to get him a big granite stone or carve it, or maybe we don't know. Maybe Leger knew Shaw too. But it is reported in the story of Clarence Shaw that this big boulder was engraved by Leon Leger. So that's three examples of his work. And I think we've located his quarry, or at least part of it, down in South Mountain. And here's a picture of South Mountain. The mountains are right here at the bottom part of the photo. North is to the top. You'll see we're at the very end of 7th Street, South 7th Street, and that road is Mineral Road. I'm pointing with my finger. Here's 7th Street. Here's the Mineral Road right there. This little thing there, that's Mystery Castle. Though at the end of the road, there is a known quarry that was there already called the Capitol Quarry. When they built the Arizona State Capitol in 1898, 1899, they used granite from this site to put for a part of the walls, and it's kind of a light colored granite. So that location has been known for a long time. When the newspaper announced that Leger had bought a quarry, they said it was a darker granite. It wasn't as light as a Capitol granite, but it was very close to where the Capitol granite was taken from. So there's an area down here that has a darker granite that's been quarried, And if you, I don't know if you read that, but it's 1,928.7 feet from the Capitol quarry. So I think that qualifies as being close enough. And that with the what seems to be the right color and the telltale signs of having been quarried, that's why I'm thinking this is Ledgely Quarry. There could be other ones right around in there too. There's an old map from 1904 that shows that a road came down and made a loop made a loop right next to the Capitol Quarry and around this basin here and went back up to 7th Avenue. So it would have had this location would have had very good access to the road. But how, you ask, do you know that it was a quarry? And this is how we know because this is the technique that they used. Well, one of the names for it is called the wedge and feather quarrying. And that's accomplished by using a bolt like that. It looks kind of like a railroad spike and two metal shims that are curved. And what they did was to drill a line of holes along the piece of rock that they wanted, put the bolt and the shims in, and just tap on each one of these bolts as up and down the rows. They didn't have to get big, heavy blows to them. Just tap, 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 tap. And after a short while, a big crack appears. And you keep going with the tapping, and the whole thing cracks and it falls off. So here you have a piece that fell off, and here you have the piece that it fell off of. And what remains, which is really nice because it helps us a lot, is those drill holes, which were cylindrical holes, because they cracked along those holes, that then half of the cylinder is on the part that was taken away from the quarry, while half of it is on the bedrock that still remains at the quarry. And you'll see that here. If you look at the piece that fell off, it looks a little easier to see, but here's a groove one, groove two, groove three, and groove four. If you look at what we'll call the bedrock, there's groove one, groove two, groove three, and groove four. You can put those back together and they should match right up. Here is a picture of the quarry at South Mountain. It's a little darker than this in real life, but this is at least a medium gray granite. It's two views of the same rock, actually, but you'll see there's a whole row. Just a lot of it here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There's a whole bunch right there. So it leaves a telltale sign on the quarry where the rock came from. And fortunately for us, it leaves a telltale sign on the monument, on the rocks that were taken to the quarry, as long as the stonemason leaves it there, which in this case apparently Legier did, because there were quite this is only three examples of several that we have at the cemetery. And you'll see again these groove marks. This is a border that would have gone around a family plot. But there's a groove mark, groove mark, groove mark right there. And here's two obvious ones here, another couple down there. Here's two huge ones right there. So that's why we think that Leger, that it all kind of ties together. We think that this Leger was a guy who was probably the only one we know of so far who was mining his own rock, and he was turning it into funeral monuments, gravestone markers. And we see the marks of where we think his grave was his quarry was the South Mountain, and where we see it on the markers here at the cemetery. So it all logically kind of goes together. There's actually a better way to do this, and that is to use what's called an analyzer, known as an X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy. And what we can do with that is to take a shot. It's like a handheld gun. You take a shot down at the quarry, and it gives you a profile of all the minerals in that piece of granite down there. And then you take a shot of one of these markers here, and that gives you a profile of all the minerals at the cemetery. And hopefully those two will match up very nicely. And you can say, well, this rock A comes from source A, you know. So anyhow, we haven't done that. That actually takes some money and some expertise that we don't have, but we're hoping maybe to get some help on that at some point, maybe a student wanting to do a project like this, because this is the only person we know that was actually making monuments in Phoenix before 1914. So that's that project. The second project has to do with Chinese burials in the cemetery. And we know of 47 Chinese men or people who were buried in the cemetery. And these would have been the sojourners who traveled over to the United States to make money to send back home. They worked on railroads, they worked on mining, a lot at mining towns, and they came into the more established cities like Phoenix, agricultural cities, and worked in restaurants and laundries and grew food and so on. So we know we have 47 people here, and the local Chinese group in town is very active and very interested in their history. And we do know that we have some items, different cultures, different practices. So the Chinese funerary practices, in some cases, are quite different from ours, and we have some evidence of those different practices. These are two different bricks that we have here, and you'll notice that each one of them has been carved or marked with Chinese characters. And if you were able to read those, you would see that it has a person's name, it has a date, and it has a city or a town or a place in China. So these bricks were used as markers. They're used as grave markers. And what they would do if the Chinese, when they were buried, if at all possible or preferable, they would really like to have the body go back home, go back where it came from, at least at some point. But it normally wasn't really possible when the person first died. So they would bury the person uh, and then make sure to make sure that when they came back 7 to 9 years later, they would pull the body back up, exhume it, clean off all the bones, make sure all 300 plus bones were there, put them in a pot or a box or something, and then ship them back to China so that he could be reburied in his hometown. But to make doubly sure that they had the right person, they didn't rely on whatever marker they put above ground. They would put a brick like this down in with the body so that when they pulled the bones out, they would have the brick and they knew exactly who it was. So, because, it'd be terrible to make a mistake. And this was their foolproof method to have it done. These two were found on the surface in Loosely Cemetery. It turns out there are a lot of bricks on the surface, almost all of which are in Loosely. So that's going to tell us something, I'm sure. But anyhow, so we have not looked at all the bricks. They need to be turned over and then put back in place and so on, because it got hot kind of quick this year. But hopefully, when it cools down again, we'll be looking some more at this and maybe find some more bricks, which would be interesting. That same 1914 article that I told you about that shut down the cemetery also had this photograph in it. And part of it, they were complaining about how messy this area was and how these Chinese have this building there doing who knows what. And what it turns out to be is what's called a Chinese funerary burner or Chinese funerary incinerator. And as I just explained, the Chinese did not bury the bodies of the dead, but they burned a lot of their possessions, such as their clothing or their favorite items, or they would give them so that they could take them with them when they on their journey to the afterlife. So they would build a brick oven like this and burn the things in addition to some food that the person would have for the trip, and also some money, which they would symbolize by just pieces of paper and throw it in there. Maybe draw a picture of a house and another piece of paper so that they would have a representation of a house. But that was all part of the ceremony. The ceremony. They would have a little feast and send the person on his or her way to the afterlife with everything that they needed to have a nice afterlife. So this is a great thing. These are not unknown in the West, although this is the only one that's been reported for Arizona. So it's unique to Arizona so far, but unfortunately, we haven't found it yet. It doesn't look like this nowadays, I guarantee you. And I've pretty much looked over the whole area where we think it should be, and I've not really found a foundation, remains of any kind of a square around it that would fit this particular item. I found one I thought did for a while, but that didn't pan out. And it's a very fuzzy photograph. This is how it looked in the newspaper. I went down and took a picture of the actual newspaper, and this is all we get. But there are not many clues here. There's a picket fence in the back. Of course, there's no picket fences in the cemetery anymore. They're long gone. There is a headstone there that kind of unusual shape. We haven't really found that either. But it's there, and we're looking for it. We're gonna again when it cools down, we're going to be looking again. And just to give you some examples of other ones that do appear in the United States, most of these are from the Mountain West, but there are also quite a few in the Pacific. The Chinese, in addition to coming to North America uh, for employment, also went down to Australia and different islands in the Pacific. And people would die there, and they would build these funeral ovens there. But there are quite a few around the West that can be seen. I like this one in the middle. I think that looks pretty close to what we have. And that one is in a cemetery in Boise, Idaho. And I think it looks pretty good, but you always have to be cautious anyways, because the Boise one here, I believe, is a reconstruction. So it has a similar roof, but it doesn't have the peak like it looks like we have up here on this one. So, but it's close, and looks pretty good. So, in trying to find this thing, we're paying attention. There's that 1914 article. There's another article that mentions it, and in the 1914 article, he takes pains to describe that this burner and the Chinese area was located just next to the Oddfellow Cemetery. That is just to the west of the Oddfellow Cemetery. So this is loosely here. I have IOOF marked here, and the rest of the cemetery is off. Oops, is off to the right is off to the right over here. So that gives us kind of a narrowed down area where the best chances should be of finding it. And that's right here in the middle of Loosely. And we do have some photos from when the cemetery was active, not very many, but we do have a couple. And this is one of them that comes from about 1910 or 1912. And what's kind of exciting about this one is that this grave is still here. We still have that headstone. So we know where this grave was at, and it's at the east end of Oddfellows, and it's looking west. So again, the newspaper report said that this burner was just west of the Oddfellows Cemetery. Maybe there's a clue here or something that we could work on. So if you look over on the left-hand side of the photo, this looks to be maybe somebody's finger, but look a little below that. We'll zoom in a little bit. And you see down below that shadow, there's a peak there. And I think that's probably a combination of a house and a tree that made that peak. That seems to be pretty far out. But you can just get a hint here of kind of a light colored, sort of a sloping kind of a whatever it is. We look a little closer, and here's what I'm talking about. This looks like it could be something similar to, now we don't want to get too excited or overread the evidence, but this looks kind of similar to the burner with that white pagoda style roof that slants up. We really can't see what's below it, but you can kind of imagine just a brick building below it. We do know that these markers are still here, and we can find these markers. They're still there today, and these are at the west end of Oddfellows. We didn't know there was a fence there, but this fence would be the correct place if there was a fence along the west line of Oddfellows Cemetery. And it's hard to see, but it looked like a second fence right over here just beyond it. So that means that this little structure thingy, whatever it is, would be right in Loosely Cemetery and in the area that we want to look at. Here's where we think it might be. Right around, I put a green circle where we think the most likely spot is that the thing might be. It turns out it's pretty hard to really, it's a lot harder than it looks to find something on the ground 100 years after the photograph was taken. But there's a place for us to start and get a more intensive search. Would start and what we're looking for, we hope that even though they used all the bricks, they tore the place down, all of these pink blocks in there are places where there are brick features, where bricks have been lining around cemeteries and so on, and they're almost all right here. This is 24 out of the 27 features that are in the cemetery. But we're hoping though, even though they scavenged all the above ground bricks, we're hoping they left us a layer of bricks on the bottom. And if that's the case, then we can soften up the ground a little bit, take just thin probes and go down 4, 6, maybe 8 inches and see if we hit any bricks and do some clanking. And then we can take it from there. Again, there is another technique called ground penetrating radar, which I'm sure you've seen on TV and that could be possibly used. It's kind of complicated in this area because, as Val said, there's a very large prehistoric Hohokam site right underneath us here, and there was a canal that went right through where the cemetery is today. But still, we're trying to be optimistic. We're trying to not overread the evidence, and we think we got some fun things to do. And if anyone's interested, we want you to know we're always welcoming new people. We always need new ideas, new hands, and just to share what's kind of an exciting uh, research projects. And that's what I have today.